Welcome back to Comfish 2022. Thanks for everybody for coming out. Want to start by just thanking our sponsors that help make all this happen: Northwind Bank and Highmark Marine Fabrication. This year we're doing a hybrid forum, so welcome to everybody that's listening online. And know at the end of the presentation, there's going to be an opportunity for questions and answers, and you can put your questions in the Q&A box that's there on the screen. So nice to see folks out and about on a lovely spring day in Kodiak. It's very white out. So next we're going to be hearing from Marysia Szymkowiak. Marysia is a research social scientist with NOAA's Alaska Fisheries Science Center. And Marysia's research focuses on how people derive value from and make choices about fisheries participation, how ecological and management changes may affect that participation. And her current work focuses on understanding how Gulf of Alaska fishing communities may adapt to climate change as part of the Gulf of Alaska Climate Integrated Modeling Project. So thank you, and thank you for joining us today virtually, Marysia, and we hope next year, future years, we can have you here in person. So thanks.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Teresa. So hopefully you guys can flag me if something doesn't work. And I can't see who's in the room, but thank you for anyone still hanging in there if it's a sunny day in Kodiak. My name is Marysia Szymkowiak. I am a social scientist with the Alaska Fisheries Science Center. I am based out of Juneau. And my presentation today sort of piggybacks off of what you were hearing from Mike, but focusing on how fishermen are experiencing climate change firsthand, how they are responding to it, and the conversations that we're having across the Gulf about how do we build resilience for our fisheries and fishing communities into the future. So if there's nothing else that you're going to take away from my presentation today, just want to kind of hone in on several key messages, one of which Mike already sort of went through. Climate change is here. It is already affecting the fisheries that many of you in Kodiak and across the Gulf participate in. These impacts from climate change are going to continue, and they're going to increase in their intensity. Adaptation is this sort of concept that we throw around a lot, but really kind of happens on a spectrum that I will go over. And we're really sort of in the coping end of things, and we want to move towards sort of more flexibility, bringing more diversity into our adaptation so that we can become more resilient to the future. Without planning, we are coping, and that can actually impede our capacity to be more adaptive into the future. And then planning for resilience really needs to and can happen now. So Mike really kind of presented on the biological impacts of climate change in the Gulf. So I'll just sort of dive into what that has meant in terms of economic impacts. The bar chart here on the top left are the fisheries disaster declarations that we've had in Alaska since the mid-1990s. And when it turns black, that's Gulf of Alaska. And it really starts to happen after the 2014 to 2016 marine heat wave, and you can see the increase in fisheries disaster declarations. I just wanted to note that not all downturns in revenues are disasters or can be claimed as disasters. We've had increasing tax for stablefish fisheries, but because the fish are so small, they're driving down prices, and revenues have actually declined, but you can't declare a fisheries disaster for that kind of thing. So overall, ex-vessel revenues have really gone down substantially for groundfish in the Gulf of Alaska since 2017 by about 55%. That, as any fisherman and fishing community knows in the Gulf of Alaska, really has substantial impacts in terms of multiplier effects. That means losses in jobs, means losses of income going into communities, losses in taxes, losses in crew employment, and so on. So these things have huge multiplier impacts across our communities. Mike also kind of went into this, but what can we expect? We can expect more ocean warming. We can expect ocean acidification in our waters, more frequent and more intense heat waves, oxygen limitation, ozone circulation, and stratification changes. There's also some opportunities. I think someone kind of picked up on this in response to Mike's presentation. We're seeing more crab fisheries kind of getting increasing in the Gulf. We're seeing a huge sort of interest in mariculture in the Gulf of Alaska, and we can anticipate northern range shifts. We're already starting to see some things happening in Southeast Alaska, including some market squid coming into Southeast, or getting more abundant. So my work is really on having conversations with fishermen about how they are perceiving climate change and how can they build more resilience into the future. So we've had interviews and workshops with fishermen. I'm really looking to have as many of these as possible. And there's some flyers on the NOAA booth there in Kodiak, sort of asking for more input. But we're really having sort of three targeted areas of discussion: ecosystem changes that fishermen are seeing, their responses to those changes, and what they need for broader adaptation planning into the future. This, as Teresa noted, is part of a much bigger interdisciplinary project across the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, where we're trying to understand how these climate scenarios will play out in terms of biological models, in terms of stock distributions and abundance, linking those to these fleet models and to community impacts. And my component of that is really to understand, in response to climate change, what are fishermen going to be doing? So in these conversations with fishermen, really, there's a number of changes that Gulf of Alaska fishermen are seeing in their systems. Most prominently, I would say smaller fish, fewer fish, a lot of variability, concerns over ocean acidification. Fishermen in the Gulf are really on the front lines of climate change. And they really speak to sort of not just these isolated impacts, but the cumulative impacts of all these changes, coupled with sort of decreased opportunities from various management systems, creating more uncertainty in how they can respond, how robust they're going to be in the face of all these things accumulating. There are shifting baselines of understanding about what a healthy stock is, what a healthy fish really looks like, and shifting understanding of the economic opportunities that can be had from fisheries. I will say that economic losses that I presented are really only just one impact. A lot of fishermen talk about undertaking more risky behavior, going out into more severe weather, which really has, a lot of impacts on your potential safety and physical well-being. Fishermen are spending more time out at sea, say in relation to small fish and sablefish, and trying to harvest their quotas. That can have impacts in terms of spending time away from family, and you know how that kind of accumulates in fishing families. All these things are causing fishermen a lot of mental distress, which is the conversations that I am having in interviews, and the kind of conversations that fishermen really have been wanting to have in these group conversations across the Gulf as well. So I introduced this concept of how adaptation happens on a spectrum. We as social scientists sort of think of adaptation as going from sort of remaining, which is these kind of business as usual practices, this more reactive change of coping to try to maintain the status quo, to more proactive strategies around adapting to increase flexibility in the system, and then really more kind of transformative system level change to be more progressive and diversified and robust in response to change. So that's sort of how we think about adaptation. It's not just a singular thing. It's really this kind of spectrum of things that people may be doing. This is largely where we are. We're in the coping end of things. Fishermen, and really our fishery systems, are largely being reactive to maintain the status quo. We're chasing fish. We're kind of undertaking temporary shoreside work, shifting our behavior sort of on the margins. From the fisheries management standpoint, we're really kind of adjusting our tax. We're closing areas, we're closing fisheries. We're doing a little bit of the adaptation component in terms of increasing flexibility. We really want to move to the right-hand side to be much more ready for what is coming down the pipe. So I also wanted to sort of note that on kind of a higher level, I guess you could say, on the community level, we have really limited adaptation planning happening across the Gulf of Alaska. We have so far 6 community and tribal entities that have formal climate plans in the Gulf of Alaska. Climate change is sometimes integrated into other planning mechanisms like our hazard plans or our comprehensive plans, but really the intersection of fisheries and climate change and how to plan for fishery systems in the Gulf of Alaska is strikingly absent across all of these plans. So I just wanted to kind of note that, as I think a lot of fishermen sort of expect that maybe adaptation planning is happening at a different level, and I just wanted to sort of point this out in relation to that. In our conversations about what is sort of getting in the way of this kind of more progressive, more proactive planning for climate change, there's a lot of barriers that fishermen bring up in terms of what's getting in the way of that. So a lot of fishermen talk about how the ways in which we've chosen to manage our systems in the North Pacific, our fishery systems, have created indebtedness, high permit costs, which really makes it less likely that fishermen can sort of easily buy into other fisheries. There's a lack of crew that fishermen bring up, as our fisheries may not seem like a great sort of entry point for a lot of young folks. We have a lot of graying of the fleet, leasing, which allows for inactive participation, or people sort of accumulating wealth while not actively fishing in our fisheries. So these are a lot of things that fishermen bring up in relation to how fisheries management may make them less resilient and less able to kind of do this more adaptive and transformative planning. We also talk about how our infrastructure and our the sort of skilled trades on the shore side are kind of missing and deteriorating. There's less working waterfront. Some of that has shifted to tourism. There's fewer support services that are able to accommodate fishermen, and less folks who know how to do that work. And then one of the things that Mike brought up in his presentation is really this idea of attribution. And the science community, as Mike was sort of speaking to, has influenced that. There's been a lot of uncertainty about the things that fishermen are seeing in their system, whether those can be directly related to climate change or not. There's also a lot of ecological variability. We had a 2-year-long heat wave, but that has sort of gone away. We've had some minimal heat waves since then, but they haven't caused this huge, ecological shift the way that the blob did. And so there's a lot of ecological variability in the system, and there's a lot of economic variability associated with that as well. And then one thing that that's not on here, but Mike brought up, is really the fact that fishermen have been so good at being resilient in the past, and that they have all these coping strategies sort of in their back pocket that they have always used, may make them less likely to sort of envision the need to be more adaptive and transformative and sort of planning for the future. So the last kind of thing that we talk about in these conversations with fishermen is, okay, given all these changes that you're seeing in the system, given all these barriers that you have towards sort of being more proactive in terms of your planning, what can you sort of envision that you need for resilience for yourself and your fishing communities? And I would say this is when fishermen really shine. There are a ton of ways in which fishermen are envisioning building resilience for their systems into the future. And I bring this up not for you guys to sort of read all these boxes and arrows and so on, but to note that that capacity to plan for resilience is really already there and just kind of needs to be built up and maximized to the extent possible. So fishermen in our conversations really focus on building resilience in the science and management process, local and national policies, and these sort of bigger public discourse, socio-cultural intersections. So I don't want to go into all of that because there's really a lot of ideas, which is kind of the focus of that previous slide, is to be kind of focus on the positive energy around the capacity for fishermen to think about resilient futures. But I did want to present on local policies, and the next slide is on sort of the fisheries management policies that fishermen are looking for. So I would say, first and foremost, are really sort of to take away the barriers that I described in terms of what is getting in the way of that sort of more proactive, progressive planning, which is making sure that we are maintaining, upgrading, and diversifying our working waterfronts and our workforce. So that speaks to sort of building skills within fishermen, but also ensuring that we have the skilled trades to support fishermen into the future. Fishermen also have expressed interest in sort of more climate planning scenarios as a way of allowing them to sort of envision what future conditions might look like, so they have the capacity to sort of envision how they adapt to that. There's also a lot of conversations around the real necessity to continue providing forums for climate discourse, being consistent in those forums, having some sort of common ground for that discourse, moving away from sort of historical allocative battles, and really providing like a level sort of playing field where fishermen can have concentrated discourse around climate change and ongoing dialogue, and not just within their fishing communities, but really linking those networks across the Gulf of Alaska. So I will say that sort of my final takeaways, that's one of the most consistent things that we've been hearing across the Gulf of Alaska fishermen is really the need to have some consistent venues for continuing these dialogues, because as you can tell, there's a lot of ideas about how to move forward. There's just no time to do that as we are essentially coping with what are already the impacts of climate change. So that kind of coping is essentially already getting in the way of having these concentrated dialogues around how to be more flexible and proactive and planning for our futures. And one of the ways that fishermen really sort of talk about how they might get there is in really sort of small scale, localized funding efforts that would target really sort of localized community ways of linking that fishing identity to a sense of empowerment around getting ready for climate change in their community. And I really just provided sort of 3 examples of the kinds of things that fishermen are talking about and sort of moving towards that. Some crew apprenticeship and mentorship programs to sort of, build up that workforce, have a way of moving permits from one generation to the other. Habitat restoration and preservation, things like creating climate refugia for salmon, so it's a habitat for that salmon can kind of hide in when the waters get hot. And then really sort of thinking about how do you maybe shift and diversify your waterfront and your skills so that you can capitalize on essentially marine tourism, non-extractive and emerging marine industries like mariculture. So really the focus there is maybe not on those specific ideas, but about how fishermen are looking for really kind of small pots of money to give them a forum to really engage in some localized efforts. And then fisheries management is the other one that I sort of wanted to focus on. Again, similarly to local policies, really the way in which fishermen sort of talk about providing for more resilience from the fisheries management system is in terms of mitigating the barriers that those systems have created in the past and into the present. So by removing these access barriers and increasing opportunities for fishermen to enter, to diversify their fisheries, and thinking about maybe mandating active participation, so people who are generating revenue from our fisheries are actively participating in them. For the fisheries management systems to be more responsive, to expedite processes that provide for mariculture permits, that allow for fishermen to seize opportunities around emergent fisheries that might be coming up from northern range shifts and so on. Fishermen are really looking for kind of a clear roadmap on how to engage in the fisheries management process. And really this kind of links to the box underneath in terms of elevating climate policy and having climate on the fisheries management agenda. Again, really the link is in terms of having this consistent discourse. So there is a place that is focused around climate change as opposed to focusing on the impacts of that on the coping strategies that we have as fishermen and as fisheries managers that are sort of reactive. So the idea here is that fishermen are really interested in having a place for more proactive planning that is consistent and having a clear roadmap of how to do that within our fisheries management system. So the Board of Fish and the North Pacific Council in Alaska. Fishermen are also really speak to the need for stability. So ensuring consistency and predictability in our systems so that they have something that they can plan around. And again, I think this really touches on that left-hand side of the spectrum on the coping and how that might destabilize fishermen and their capacity to plan for the future around a given fishing portfolio and their expectations of earnings around that. And then really principled management, a system that manages with diverse representation within those sort of sitting around the table, but also those sitting in the room and informing the process, precautionary and ecosystem based management. So wanted to, again, kind of focus on the summary points, really driving the point home about how climate change is already happening in our fisheries systems. It is already something that fishermen are dealing with, and they are largely coping with climate change. Planning for resilience needs to and really can happen now. I think in my conversations with fishermen, a lot of times we sort of enter into this discourse around, well, I don't know, climate change is this sort of big looming existential crisis. I don't really have any ideas. But once you sort of move away from the notion that we are having a conversation around fishermen's capacity to sort of mitigate climate change, they really have a robust portfolio of things that they think would make fisheries more resilient. And I think that's sort of when you hone in on how fishermen have been so resilient in the past, and really using that resilience not to sort of utilize the sort of back pocket strategies that fishermen have employed in the past to adapt to various changes, but to use that resilience to allow for more concentrated conversations about how we move to this right-hand side of proactive, flexible, systemic change that makes fishermen and our fishing communities that are so dependent on our fisheries resilient. So like I was saying, fishermen have a lot of ideas about how to move forward on that with really kind of specific things. But I would say the overall things to maybe take away are that fishermen are really ready to have clear and targeted conversations around climate change. And we as climate scientists really need to be effective in communicating the fact that climate change is here. The things that are happening in our systems are really related to climate change, so that fishermen can have that attribution in place so that they can plan for their own futures. And then really that fishermen are looking to have a place for those conversations to be consistent, for those conversations to be built around networks that are across fisheries, across our fishing communities, that really provide for sort of broader, more effective, proactive planning into the future. So I guess those are kind of my overarching messages, that we are in a place where we need to plan for the future, and fishermen are absolutely ready to do that. What we need to do is make sure that we are having consistent conversations around climate change, and not just around the things that we are coping with as a result of climate change that are sort of, you know, creating barriers for these conversations between fishermen and fishing sectors and so on. So I would say those are my overarching messages. And thank you to all the fishermen across the Gulf of Alaska who have shared their experiences with me and my team. And really everything I have said to you is directly in relation to the things that fishermen have been telling me. So I have been asked to amplify their voices, and I hope that I have seized this opportunity in doing so. So I will stop sharing my screen in case I can actually see some questions, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And I want to commend you on the tremendous amount of outreach you've done through Gulf of Alaska fishing communities. And it was really evident in this PowerPoint today that you've really captured a lot of the sentiment from the fishing fleet in your slides. So thank you for that. So I'll open the floor for questions now. Does anybody have any questions for Marysia? We have her here for a few more minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the problem with a lot of people I know, excuse me, is the politically charged phrase climate change brings up images of people who really don't want the United States to stay a sovereign nation. They would prefer the Republican form of government is replaced by neo-Marxism. And so our skin kind of crawls, some of us, when we hear that climate change. I wonder, you know, because I was a commercial fisherman for almost 20 years in this archipelago. And so I saw one time when the ocean temperature was a little warmer than it was supposed to be in all those years. And I realized as a college graduate that data and statistics can be manipulated. And if you get the political pressure there with the scientists, that's going to happen a lot faster. And I'm not trying to be the devil's advocate. It's just, I think it's an issue that's got to be looked at, because I don't think any of us are discounting the symptoms. It's just the diagnosis of climate change that we're having a real struggle with. And another point I wanted to make, you mentioned graying of the fleet. Some people are saying that the answer to, part of the answer to climate change would be reduction of population through abortion on demand. Well, I'm a retired commercial fisherman whose mother would have been, in certain areas, key areas, she might have been 1,000 times better off if she had aborted me. I'm thankful she didn't. But I do not believe that Lisa Murkowski's position of allowing abortion is going to help graying of the fleet, because you can't bring future fishermen into the fleet by killing them off. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that. I think, that the fishermen that I have talked to across the Gulf of Alaska, they may not use the phrase climate change in linking what they're seeing in their system, but we talk about ecosystem change, and we talk about how that consistent change and how that is affecting their bottom line, but also just their overall well-being in terms of, being able to predict where the fish are going to be and being able to harvest them in an amount of time that lets you spend time with your family and enjoy other parts of life. Those are the kinds of conversations that we have. And a lot of times those aren't linked to necessarily climate change, but those are linked to a change that is consistent enough for fishermen to feel like something is different. I need to plan for that something to be consistently different and potentially increasing into the future. And I would say, so that's sort of one answer to that. And then the other thing is that fishermen are really kind of bring up what you brought up in terms of having some foundations for integrating different viewpoints, so that those viewpoints are at the table when we are, trying to be more proactive in our planning approach. So maybe moving away from climate change as the thing that we are talking about can bring more fishermen to the table and drive some of that kind of more proactive thinking. So I guess I would say that, and I'm not sure about the graying of the fleet and the Murkowski connection itself. I think the bigger point there is that even without climate change, if we don't have young people who are interested in being crew, who are interested in buying our permits, we are already a lot less resilient than we would have been even without climate change. So the graying of the fleet and the lack of generational turnover in our fisheries would already make us much less resilient into the future. And climate change is, sort of compounding that, or graying of the fleet is sort of compounding the impacts of climate change and making us less resilient. But thanks for bringing that up.
Michael?
Hi, Marysia. This is Michael from Sitka Salmon Shares. I loved how you categorized where we are now with the coping and how we need to get to the adaptation point. And I'm interested in hearing your perspective on fishery disaster declarations and how there is a subsection of funding that goes to climate research. And is that considered coping? And if it is, then how do we create that avenue to be adaptation?
Yeah. Hey, Michael. Everyone's really fuzzy, so I can't even tell who's in the room. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing to bring up. I would say what that sort of brings up in my mind is how we could sort of envision using those kinds of mechanisms not just for sort of biological climate change research, which I think is what that largely funds, but thinking about these more, socio-cultural, economic initiatives that fishermen are interested in undertaking to sort of be more adaptive in their system. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question at all, or I'm sort of just brainstorming based on that idea that you brought up.
Well, it's definitely an open-ended question, so thank you for your feedback.
Thanks, Michael.
Darius?
Hello, Marysia. Darius Kasperzak here.
Hey.
Do you see an avenue forward or any momentum for NOAA to perhaps address climate change and warming ocean conditions in a sort of in a forum to be made available to assist commercial fishermen and communities on kind of a micro level, par a community or spatially located in the Gulf or something like that would help us with our long-term planning? Like, we have a sort of a prediction of so much offshore grazes off this community, which would lead to more upwelling, more nutrients. This may, with some degree of probability, affect these fisheries. And of course, a big one, is temperature. Like there is so much of a probability of a La Nina switching to an El Nino, and there's a certain probability factor of this heightened water temperature that may result in that will probably lead to low cod survivability rates or inability of salmon to get up streams or anything. Do you see a way forward for NOAA to kind of tailor that kind of information for Pacific communities, especially in Alaska? Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Darius. As you know, since we've talked, that's definitely something that NOAA, I think, increasingly recognizes that it needs to do better. And I think that a lot of folks, including Mike, who presented before me, would be fairly honest about how poorly we have communicated our science to fishermen in the past. And it's certainly something that I am working on with scientists at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center about how do we bridge that gap. A lot of our science is really targeted at the fisheries management process and misses the capacity to inform fishermen in how they make decisions for, any given fishing year, but also sort of planning for the future. And I think, we at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center are very aware of that and are increasingly working on it. I think at the, kind of higher NOAA level that there's a lot of interest in thinking about that kind of thing and in thinking about, sort of these more localized efforts. Like, different communities are sort of focused on different aspects of building their own resilience. And I think we shouldn't sort of come in with some overarching notions that we think of, as an agency about how that would be effective at a localized scale. I think that needs to sort of come from the bottom up. And that's another thing that NOAA is increasingly interested in, about sort of thinking about how to fund these small efforts to build that kind of localized resilience. So I hear you, Darius, about that necessity. I think we are trying to create mechanisms to do that effectively. And then, we have still a lot to learn. So I and a lot of Science Center scientists are interested in figuring out how do you make that system dynamic and effective into the future. You know, what kind of information are fishermen looking for? Because it's really diversified across the Gulf. You know, you might be looking for something, someone in Sitka might be looking for a really different kind of science. So one of the things that's come out of this project is myself and Mike and a number of other Science Center scientists are working on an effort about sort of targeting that question that you brought up, Darius, about how do we inform fishermen with the climate science that they need for their decision and planning, and then how do we integrate fishermen into our processes so that they are giving us sort of on the ground information about what is changing that we can incorporate into better models, into better science products, into better management systems. So, and that has in part kind of come out of this work where fishermen like yourself are telling me and my team, you know, we really need to have more information from scientists that is specific to, these are the kinds of things that I need for planning, right? And so that has sort of led to the development of this effort across the Science Center, where we're going to be trying to figure out exactly how to do that, you know, sort of more systematically into the future. So thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you again, Marysia. I know there's a common theme throughout Alaska fishing communities and throughout, you know, Alaska fishing communities throughout the nation as we want to maintain resiliency in face of these changes. And I know the fishing lifestyle is something that we're all really willing to fight for. So that kind of leads me to, I think it'll be our last question. We're going to be moving into the next forum. What are the next steps for your project and how it will continue? Because I think we've just seen two great examples with your presentation and Mike's presentation earlier of making the linkage with the science and the fishermen and, you know, social science and the fishermen, and that working together, we can help build these resilient fishing communities that we're all looking to maintain. So kind of what do you see as the next steps, and how can, you know, we as a fishing community continue to help provide venues to get this information out?
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. Well, like I said in the beginning, I'm really looking to have more of these conversations with fishermen about what they're seeing, how they're responding, and what they think they need for themselves and for their fishing communities to sort of build resilience into the future. And I would say that NOAA is really interested in that kind of on the ground, what do fishermen really need from their fisheries and from us? You know, how do we become more resilient? I will say that as I was sort of presenting, there's a lot of ideas about how do you build more resilience across these sort of different axes, from science and management to local national policies to sort of these sociocultural dimensions. But we across the Gulf are not quite there in terms of thinking about how do you prioritize these kinds of initiatives or strategies. How do you get the funding for them? How do you kind of move forward? So that is, I think, sort of where my work is heading in terms of getting fishermen to go through that process and in building these networks with fishermen within communities and across the Gulf, so that we are having more concerted conversations around that. And then I think the work is really evolving in response to what fishermen are saying that they need and what we at NOAA, you know, can provide. And sort of speaking to what Darius was just bringing up, that this project about linking fisheries scientists with fishermen to understand, you know, what kind of climate science they need and how to sort of build these information gaps into our processes. that's like that is another thing that has evolved from this project. So I think there's a number of ways in which fishermen are informing how this conversation is being built within NOAA and the kinds of things that NOAA is sort of, light bulbs going off about what they need to do to help fishermen into the future. So again, I think that's, why I am really appealing to fishermen across the Gulf to talk to me, because we are just at a time right now as an agency at NOAA and as a nation to really be having these conversations. And there's a lot of interest to really kind of help fishermen. And so the more ideas that are laid out on the table, the better off we all are in terms of how someone in DC is thinking about how, Gulf of Alaska fishing communities need to build resilience into the future. So yeah, thanks for that, Teresa. And thank you to everyone in the room who has talked to me and for the opportunity to share this work and the views of your fellow fishermen across the Gulf.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sounds ongoing dialogue. Yeah.
Thanks.
We have just a couple minutes before our next presentation. These conversations are so good.